The temperature in the upscale lounge didn't just drop when he walked in, it plummeted. It wasn't merely the razor-sharp lines of his tailored suit or the way the manager's spine curved in a submissive, desperate bow. It was the absolute, crushing silence that trailed him like a shadow. In a place like the Onyx, silence was a luxury, and survival for a waitress like Melhane meant staying invisible. But tonight, the Golden Trio, the co-workers who had turned her shifts into a psychological battlefield, had decided to break that invisibility. "Do it, Melhane," one hissed, shoving a tray into her trembling hands. One kiss on the cheek of the man in the corner suite, and the bullying stops. "We leave you alone for good." Behind them, phone cameras were already raised like weapons, lenses aimed and ready to broadcast her humiliation to the world. They were pointing at Jinvaar. Brief pause. He sat in the VIP shadows like a king on a throne of ice. A man of quiet dominance, with a stare so hard and controlled it seemed to command the very air in the room. He was the chairman, a title that suggested immense wealth, but a posture that whispered of a much more dangerous background. Melhane approached him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected a cold dismissal. She expected his security to intervene. But as she leaned in and pressed her lips to his, the world outside that corner suite ceased to exist. The man didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand shot up with lightning speed, not to push her back, but to catch her chin between his fingers. With a terrifying, quiet dominance, he tilted her head back, forcing her to look into the eyes of a predator who had just found his prey. As she gasped and retreated, her eyes fell upon the leather wallet resting open on the table. A gold-embossed card stared back at her. Chairman, Jinvaar. Sang-Hee Syndicate. The blood drained from her face. She thought the kiss meant nothing, until the Korean Mafia boss proved exactly who she had just touched. The silence in the lounge was absolute, a heavy weight that seemed to press the very breath from Melhane's lungs. She stood frozen, her lips still tingling from the heat of a contact she had never intended to be real. Behind her, the sharp, muffled giggles of the Golden Trio had died away, replaced by the sound of rapid footsteps as they realized the air had turned toxic. They had wanted a show, but the man before them was not a performer, he was a judge. Jinvaar did not move. He sat perfectly still, his large hand still anchoring her chin, his thumb brushing against the line of her jaw with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl and burn all at once. His eyes, dark and fathomless, didn't just look at her, they searched her, stripping away the waitress uniform and the forced smile until only her raw, unguarded fear remained. "I dare," he murmured. His voice was a rich, low vibration that seemed to hum in the floorboards beneath her feet. "That is what they called it, isn't it?" Melhane tried to find her voice, but her throat was a desert. She managed a small jerky nod, her natural hair brushing against his knuckles. The contrast of her warmth against his cool, calculated stillness was terrifying. She waited for him to snap, for his security detail to haul her into the back alley, or for him to simply sneer and wipe his mouth. Instead, Jinvaar leaned forward, his face inches from hers, filling her entire field of vision. The scent of expensive sandalwood and something cold, like steel, wrapped around her. "You should be careful what you claim as yours, Melhane. Even for 3 seconds." He slowly released her chin, the loss of his touch feeling strangely like a drop in pressure. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow movement, he reached for the leather wallet resting on the mahogany table. He didn't hide it. He didn't tuck it away. He let it fall open, the amber bar light catching the glint of a gold-embossed card. "Chairman, Jinvaar. Sang-Hee Syndicate." Melhane's gaze locked onto the words. The name Sang-Hee wasn't just a corporate title, it was a ghost story whispered in the docks and the backrooms of the city's elite. It was a name associated with shadows, vanished rivals, and an empire built on absolute ruthless loyalty. Her heart missed a beat, then thudded with a sickening force. She hadn't just kissed a wealthy stranger, she had touched the untouchable. Jinvaar watched the realization shatter her expression. He didn't look angry. If anything, there was a flicker of something new in his controlled stare, a dark, simmering curiosity. "Go," he commanded, the word as sharp as a blade. Melhane didn't wait. She turned, her legs feeling like lead as she stumbled away from the corner suite. She could feel his eyes on her back, marking her, tracing the line of her spine as she fled toward the safety of the kitchens. She burst through the swinging doors, gasping for air, her mind screaming that it was over. But as she leaned against the cold stainless steel of the prep table, she felt a weight in her pocket that hadn't been there before. She reached in, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a heavy matte black coin with a single gold character engraved on the face. A mark. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The kiss was over, but the game had only just begun, and Jinvaar had no intention of letting her lose. The humid night air offered no comfort as Melhane practically ran from the service entrance of the Onyx. Her uniform was damp with sweat, and her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that burned her chest. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The weight of the black coin in her pocket felt like a brand, a physical tether linking her to the man in the corner suite. Every shadow between the street lamps seemed to stretch toward her, taking on the silhouette of a broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. She reached the subway station in a blur of motion, her eyes darting toward every passenger who lingered too long near the pillars. The city felt different tonight, predatory and loud. The screech of the train on the tracks sounded like a warning, a metallic scream she couldn't ignore. She kept her head down, her natural hair obscuring her face as she huddled into the corner of the subway car, clutching her bag against her stomach. When she finally reached her neighborhood, a modest block of brick walk-ups tucked away from the neon glare of the city center, she allowed herself a single shaking exhale. This was her territory. Here, she was just Melhane, the girl from apartment 4B. The Sang-Hee Syndicate didn't belong in these narrow streets. The chairman didn't exist here. She turned the final corner, her keys already gripped between her knuckles, ready to bolt inside and throw every deadbolt she owned. But as her building came into view, her footsteps faltered, then stopped entirely. The street was lined with older rusted sedans and dented hatchbacks, but sitting directly beneath the flickering light of her front door was a vehicle that looked like a shard of midnight. It was a long obsidian black sedan with windows so deeply tinted they reflected the street like a mirror. Its engine was silent, but the soft rhythmic hum of its exhaust suggested it had been waiting for a long time. Melhane froze, her heart stopping in her throat. The Golden Trio had called it a joke, a simple dare to humiliate the quiet girl, but as the rear door of the sedan began to swing open with a slow mechanical grace, she realized the joke was over. A man stepped out. He wasn't Jinvaar, but his presence was just as chilling, a monolith in a dark overcoat, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood by the open door, his gaze fixed on her with the unwavering patience of a hunter. "The chairman is not a man who enjoys waiting, Melhane," the stranger said, his voice devoid of emotion. She looked up at the windows of her apartment, seeing the familiar glow of her bedside lamp through the curtains. It had been her sanctuary only an hour ago. Now, it felt like a trap. She looked at the open door of the car, a dark void waiting to swallow her whole. The realization settled over her with the weight of a tombstone. There was no hiding. There was no going back to the girl who stayed invisible. She took a single trembling step forward, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the coin in her pocket. The air around her seemed to tighten, the silence of the street becoming deafening as she reached the edge of the obsidian car. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pulse in her ears. The man didn't answer. He simply gestured toward the plush, leather interior, and the silhouette of the man already waiting in the shadows of the back seat. The following morning, the sun offered no warmth to the glass and steel of the city, and Melhane felt as though she were walking through a dream that had turned into a slow-motion disaster. She had returned to the Onyx not because she was brave, but because she was desperate. In her world, missing a shift was the first step toward the street, and she hoped, foolishly, that the daylight would strip the previous night of its supernatural weight. But the atmosphere inside the lounge was different. The managers were whispering in tight circles, and the Golden Trio sat in the corner, their usual arrogance replaced by a ghostly pallor. They didn't even look at her as she donned her apron. They looked through her, as if she were already gone. She was polishing glasses at the back of the bar when the heavy front doors swung open. It wasn't evening yet, the bar shouldn't have been open to the public, but no one stopped the man who walked in. Jinvaar didn't come with an entourage this time. He moved alone, his presence occupying the room with such gravity that the hum of the air conditioning seemed to die away. Melhane's hands shook, the cloth slipping from her fingers. She watched him approach, his eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying predatory focus. He didn't stop at the tables. He walked straight to the service gate, pushed it open, and stepped into her narrow workspace. The proximity was overwhelming. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain returned, filling her senses until she felt lightheaded. I was going to call," she lied, her voice cracking. "To apologize. For the dare. I didn't know who Jinvaar reached out, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He didn't touch her skin this time. Instead, he placed his palm on the bar behind her, effectively pinning her between the mahogany and his own solid frame. He leaned down, his face stopping inches from hers. "Do you think I'm here for an apology, Melhane?" His voice was a low velvet rasp that made her heart stutter. She looked up at him, seeing the flecks of gold in his dark irises, realizing for the first time the sheer scale of the power she had toyed with. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her breath hitching. "Please. I just want my life back." Jinvaar's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a flicker of dark hunger crossing his controlled features. "Your life as you knew it ended the moment you touched me. I don't care for words, and I certainly don't care for regret." He reached out with his free hand, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip, pulling it down just enough to reveal her startled gasp. "You chose to start a game with the chairman of the Sang-Hee Syndicate. And in my world, we play until the end." He pulled a small high-tech device from his pocket, an official-looking transponder. He set it on the bar between them. "This is your new schedule. You will report to my estate every evening at 6. You will not be serving drinks." Melhane felt the walls closing in. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had caught the eye of a dragon. "And if I refuse?" Jinvaar leaned in even closer, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice dropping to a chillingly intimate silk. "Then I suppose your co-workers will find out exactly what happens to those who waste my time." He pulled back, his expression returning to that unreadable, stone-cold mask. He didn't wait for her consent. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the center of the bar, the black transponder blinking like a heartbeat. A silent countdown to a life she no longer owned. Days following the encounter at the bar were no longer measured by hours, but by the weight of eyes Melhane could not see. She tried to return to the rhythm of her ordinary life, walking the familiar cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood and taking the same crowded subway, but the world had developed a chilling symmetry. Everywhere she went, the air felt occupied. The realization first hit her on a Tuesday afternoon. Melhane was leaving a small grocery store, clutching a paper bag of oranges, when she noticed a silver SUV idling at the curb. It wasn't the obsidian sedan from before, but the driver sat with the same unnatural military stillness. When she turned the corner, the car moved. When she stopped to tie her shoe, the car slowed. It wasn't a chase, it was a procession. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prick at her skin. She ducked into a crowded park, weaving through families and joggers, hoping to lose herself in the chaos of the public. But as she emerged on the other side, she saw them. Two men in identical charcoal suits stood near the fountain, their gazes sweeping the crowd with the clinical precision of predators. They didn't look like tourists or businessmen. They looked like extensions of the chairman's will. As she quickened her pace, her foot caught on an uneven paving stone. She stumbled, the bag of oranges slipping from her grip. Before she could even gasp, a hand caught her elbow, firm, steady, and impossible to shake. "Careful, Miss Melhane." The voice was low and devoid of warmth. She looked up into the face of one of the men from the fountain. He didn't smile. He didn't apologize for the intrusion. He simply held her upright until she regained her balance, then reached down to retrieve her groceries with a practiced robotic grace. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you following me?" The man handed her the bag, his eyes remaining as flat as glass. "The chairman has invested significantly in your safety. Our presence is not a request, it is a condition." Melhane backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked around the park and realized the true scale of her predicament. The man to her left, the driver in the silver SUV, the shadow lingering by the subway entrance, they weren't there to protect her from the world. They were there to ensure she remained exactly where Jinvaar wanted her. She was no longer a waitress, a neighbor, or a stranger in a crowd. She was a marked woman, a piece of property currently being inventoried by the Sang-Hee Syndicate. She turned and ran toward her apartment, the sound of synchronized footsteps echoing behind her, a constant reminder that her privacy had been executed the moment her lips touched the chairman's. When she finally slammed her front door and leaned against the wood, gasping for air, a soft chime originated from her pocket. She pulled out the transponder Jinvaar had left on the bar. A single line of text glowed on the small screen, a direct message from the man who owned the shadows now surrounding her. 6 o'clock. Do not be late. The countdown had reached its end. The invisible girl was dead, and the chairman was coming to claim what remained. And Melhane realized with a sickening jolt that she didn't even have the power to say no. The transition from the world Melhane knew to the one Jinvaar occupied was silent, swift, and absolute. At exactly 6 o'clock, the obsidian sedan arrived not just at her curb, but as a finality to her freedom. There was no packing of suitcases, no lingering goodbyes to her cramped apartment. The men in charcoal suits simply gestured toward the door, their presence a silent command that her old life was no longer a safe harbor. The elevator in the Sang-Hee corporate tower ascended with a stomach-dropping speed, bypassed the offices, and opened directly into a space that defied the laws of the city below. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadow, perched so high that the clouds seemed to drift through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was cold, minimalist, and smelled of the same sandalwood that had haunted her dreams since the night at the bar. Jinvaar was standing by the window, his back to the room. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were built for power, not just appearance. He looked like a man who owned the horizon, and for a moment, Melhane felt like a speck of dust caught in his orbit. "This is not a home," Melhane said, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "It's a prison." Jinvaar turned slowly, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "It is the only square mile in this city where I can guarantee you will keep breathing, Melhane. My enemies do not distinguish between a lover and a girl who made a reckless mistake on a Friday night." The word lover hung in the air, thick and provocative. Melhane took a step forward, her natural hair framing a face etched with defiance despite the trembling of her hands. "I am neither. I am a waitress you kidnapped because your ego couldn't handle a 3-second kiss." Jinvaar moved then, crossing the vast distance of the room with a predatory grace that made her breath hitch. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He looked down at her, his dark eyes darkening further, a flicker of something raw and dangerous finally breaking through his calculated mask. "You think this is about ego?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "You walked into my world, Melhane. You touched the one man in this city no one dares to look in the eye. You didn't just give me a kiss, you gave me a claim." He reached out, his hand moving to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. It wasn't an act of violence, but one of overwhelming possession. The tension between them snapped like a frayed wire. The air became electric, heavy with the weight of everything they weren't saying. Melhane looked up at him, her vulnerability clashing with a sudden sharp awareness of the man behind the monster. "I won't be a trophy," she whispered, her heart pounding against the wall of his chest. Jinvaar leaned down, his lips a hair's breadth from hers, his thumb tracing the pulse point in her throat. "A trophy stays in a case. You are the only thing that has made me feel alive in 10 years. And I have no intention of letting you go." The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was a gilded cage, and as Jinvaar's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, Melhane realized the most terrifying truth of all. The bars weren't just the glass walls of the penthouse. They were the way she was looking back at him. Days in the penthouse were marked by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, but the nights revealed the true machinery of Jinvaar's life. Melhane soon discovered that the glass walls did not just offer a view of the city, they acted as a filter, allowing her to witness a world conducted in a language of absolute authority and unspoken threats. From the shadows of the mezzanine, she watched as Jinvaar transformed. The man who had held her chin with a terrifying tenderness was gone, replaced by the chairman of the Sang-Hee Syndicate. He sat at a massive obsidian desk, surrounded by men who looked like they were carved from granite. There was an elegance to it, the fine silk of his shirts, the meticulous way he poured tea for visitors, the soft classical music that hummed in the background. But beneath the refinement lay a jagged, visceral brutality. One evening, a man was brought in who did not sit. He knelt. His voice was a frantic staccato of apologies, begging for more time regarding a shipment that had gone missing at the docks. Melhane watched from above, her fingers gripping the cold marble railing. Jinvaar didn't shout. He didn't even stand up. He simply set his porcelain cup down with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Time is the only thing I do not sell," Jinvaar said, his voice a low, lethal silk. He made a slight gesture with his left hand. One of his guards stepped forward and placed a heavy, serrated blade on the desk. The elegance of the room suddenly felt like a lie. The contrast was sickening, the scent of expensive lilies in the air clashing with the raw primal scent of fear radiating from the man on the floor. Melhane realized then that Jinvaar's power wasn't just in his wealth, it was in his ability to bridge the gap between high society and the gutter without ever losing his composure. The visitor was led away, his face the color of ash. Jinvaar remained seated, staring at the blade on his desk as if it were nothing more than a letter opener. He looked up then, his gaze unerringly finding Melhane in the shadows of the balcony. There was no apology in his eyes, only a dark, silent invitation to witness the truth of who he was. She descended the stairs slowly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She stopped at the edge of his desk, her natural hair catching the dim light of the study. The blade sat between them, a cold reminder of the world she had accidentally kissed into existence. "Is this what you wanted me to see?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of horror and a strange involuntary pull toward his strength. The blood behind the silk. Jinvaar stood, the movement slow and deliberate. He walked around the desk until he was inches from her, the sheer gravity of his presence forcing her to look up. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip just as it had in the bar, but his touch felt different now, heavier, laden with the secrets of the men he broke. "I wanted you to see the reality of the claim you made," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "In my world, there is no such thing as a harmless kiss. There is only loyalty, or the end." Melhane looked at the man who held her fate in his hands, realizing that she was no longer just a spectator. She was becoming part of the language he spoke. The terror was still there, but beneath it, a dangerous, forbidden curiosity began to take root. She was in the heart of the storm, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted the wind to stop. The illusion of safety within the penthouse shattered on a Thursday afternoon, proving that even a fortress of glass has its fractures. Jinvaar had been gone since dawn, attending a summit of the city's underworld families, leaving Melhane to wander the silent, marble halls alone. She had grown used to the quiet, but today, the air felt thin, vibrating with a frequency that set her teeth on edge. The breach didn't come with the sound of gunfire or breaking glass. It arrived in the form of a gift, a small wooden box left on the center of the dining table that hadn't been there minutes before. Melhane approached it slowly, her heart beginning its familiar, frantic rhythm. Inside, resting on a bed of crushed red velvet, was a single, severed finger wearing a gold signet ring she recognized from the bar. It belonged to the manager of the Onyx. Beneath the velvet lay a handwritten note in elegant, traditional script. "The chairman's treasures are poorly guarded." Terror, cold and viscous, flooded her veins. She turned to find the guards who were usually stationed at the door, but the foyer was empty. The silence of the penthouse was no longer peaceful, it was a vacuum. She realized then that Jinvaar's power was a double-edged sword. To be his was to be a target, a vulnerable nerve ending that his enemies could squeeze to see him flinch. A shadow moved by the far window. Melhane spun around, her breath hitching in her throat. A man she had never seen before stood there, silhouetted against the bright city skyline. He was older than Jinvaar, his face scarred by years of a life lived in the trenches of the Syndicate wars. This was Park, a rival whose name she had heard whispered in the dark corners of the study, a man who had lost his territory to the Sang-Hee rise and had been looking for a way back in ever since. "He chose a beautiful weakness," Park said, his voice like grinding stones. He didn't move toward her, but the threat was a physical presence in the room. "Jinvaar thinks he can rule with his head, but he has finally led with his heart. That makes him human, and humans can be broken." Melhane backed away, her natural hair damp with the sweat of sudden, sharp adrenaline. She reached for the heavy crystal decanter on the sideboard, her fingers trembling as she gripped the glass. "He will kill you for coming here." Park let out a dry, hacking laugh. "He will try. But by the time he returns, the message will have been delivered." He took a single step forward, and Melhane realized with a sickening jolt that her bodyguards hadn't been overpowered, they had been bribed. The reach of the shadow was longer than Jinvaar's protection. Just as Park reached into his coat, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. The sound was a thunderclap that shook the floor. Jinvaar stood in the threshold, his face a mask of such primal unadulterated rage that even Park faltered. He didn't look like a chairman or a businessman. He looked like death incarnate, his eyes fixed on the man standing too close to his claim. The air in the room didn't just freeze, it died. Park began to raise his weapon, but Jinvaar was already moving, a blur of motion fueled by a dark, possessive fury. Melhane dropped to her knees as the first shot echoed through the glass cathedral, and for the first time, She understood that being Jinvaar's meant she would never truly be safe again. The gunshot was a deafening crack that shattered the expensive silence of the penthouse, followed immediately by the crystalline spray of a falling vase. Melhane huddled on the floor, her hands over her head, as the room transformed into a chaotic blur of violence. Jinvaar didn't take cover. He moved with a terrifying, fluid precision, closing the distance between himself and Park before the rival could level his weapon a second time. There was no elegance in what followed, only the raw, unchecked brutality of a man protecting his most vital possession. Jinvaar's fist connected with Park's jaw with a sickening thud, a sound that resonated through the marble floor. He disarmed the older man with a brutal twist of the wrist that elicited a sharp crack of bone. As Park fell, Jinvaar didn't stop. He descended upon him like a shadow made of iron, his face twisted into a mask of cold, unadulterated rage. Melhane watched, paralyzed, as the man she thought she knew disappeared. This was the monster the city feared, the dragon of the Sang-Hee Syndicate. Jinvaar's movements were efficient and merciless, each strike designed to break, not just to subdue. He pinned Park against the shattered remains of the dining table, his fingers closing around the man's throat with enough force to turn his face a deep, bruised purple. "You thought you could touch what is mine." Jinvaar's voice wasn't a shout, it was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "You thought you could use her to send a message to me?" The violence was visceral, a primal display of dominance that left the room smelling of copper and adrenaline. For a moment, Melhane saw death in Jinvaar's eyes. He looked ready to tear the life from the man with his bare hands, his knuckles split and bleeding, his white shirt stained with the evidence of his wrath. He was terrifying. He was a creature of blood and shadow, and for the first time, she truly understood that the man she had kissed was a predator who lived on a different plane of morality. Then, his gaze flickered toward her. He saw her trembling on the floor, her eyes wide with a combination of shock and horror. The transition was jarring. The murderous fire in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, banking itself behind a wall of sudden, desperate concern. He shoved Park's limp form toward the guards who had finally stormed into the room to reclaim their posts, their faces pale with the knowledge of their failure. Jinvaar didn't stay to finish the execution. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and dropped to his knees in front of Melhane. His hands, still shaking with the remnants of his fury, hovered near her face, hesitant to touch her with the blood of his enemy still wet on his skin. "Melhane," he breathed, his voice cracking for the first time. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on her cheek, his touch surprisingly light despite the carnage he had just unleashed. The monster was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, but as he pulled her into the hard protective curve of his chest, the air in the room finally began to move again, a soft, shuddering exhale in the wake of the storm. He held her with a fierce, desperate strength, his face buried in her natural hair as he whispered a promise of safety that sounded more like a threat to the rest of the world. In that moment, the fear of the man merged with a terrifying, undeniable realization. She was the only thing holding the monster back from the edge. The following morning, the penthouse felt like a hollow shell of its former grandeur. The shattered glass had been swept away, and the blood had been scrubbed from the marble floors, but the air remained thick with the metallic tang of the previous night's violence. Melhane stood by the expansive windows, watching the city wake up far below. From this height, the people looked like ants, oblivious to the monsters that moved among them. The sound of soft footsteps announced Jinvaar's presence. He had changed into a fresh suit, but a dark bruise bloomed along his jawline, and his knuckles were wrapped in clean white gauze. He didn't approach her with his usual dominance. He stopped several feet away, his shadow stretching long across the floor to touch the hem of her dress. "The car is waiting downstairs," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of its usual melodic threat. "My men will take you back to your apartment. Your belongings have already been returned. The lease is paid for the next 3 years, and a trust has been established in your name. You will never have to work a shift at the Onyx again." Melhane turned, her natural hair catching the pale morning light. She looked at the man who had appended her universe, expecting to feel a wave of relief. Instead, she felt a cold, hollowing ache. "You're letting me go?" Jinvaar's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "I saw your face last night, Melhane. When the monster came out. You weren't just afraid of Park, you were afraid of me." He looked away, his gaze fixing on a point somewhere on the distant horizon. "I promised to protect you. If you stay here, the only thing I can't protect you from is what I am. Go back to your invisible life." It's what you wanted. Melhane looked at the door, then back at the man who stood in the center of his lonely kingdom. She thought of her small apartment, the rude customers, and the golden trio who would eventually find someone else to torment. She thought of a life where no one looked at her the way Jinvaar did, as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. She took a step toward him, then another, until she was standing within the circle of his scent. The sandalwood was faint now, overshadowed by the sharp smell of antiseptic. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the bandages on his hand. "I thought I wanted to be invisible," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I thought I wanted a life where nothing happened. But then you happened." Jinvaar finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a sign of hesitation. "If you stay, there is no turning back. Park was only the beginning. My world is a series of wars, and you will be the target in every single one of them." Melhane didn't pull away. Instead, she reached up and placed her palm against the bruise on his jaw, her touch a deliberate claim. "I've spent my whole life running from shadows. I think I'd rather stand beside the man who commands them." The silence that followed was different from the others. It wasn't a prison or a cage. It was an acceptance. Jinvaar's hand came up to cover hers, his fingers pressing her palm firmly against his skin as if to ensure she was real. The choice had been made, and as he leaned down to rest his forehead against hers, Melhane realized the most dangerous truth of all. She wasn't just in his world anymore. She was the heart of it. The following weeks were a slow immersion into the gears of an empire that never slept. Melhane no longer watched Jinvaar from the balcony. She sat in the room, a silent witness to the endless procession of desperate men and weary lieutenants. She began to realize that the chairman was not just a title of power, but a sentence of perpetual vigilance. Late one evening, the penthouse was quiet, save for the low hum of a distant rainstorm against the reinforced glass. Melhane found Jinvaar in the library, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he pored over a map of the city's shipping districts. He looked exhausted. The sharp, intimidating lines of his face had softened into something human, and for the first time, she saw the dark circles beneath his eyes. "You haven't slept in 2 days," she said, stepping into the warm glow of the desk lamp. Jinvaar didn't look up immediately. He traced a line along the waterfront with a tired finger. "If I sleep, the balance shifts. There are 300 families in the Sang-Hee network, Melhane. If a shipment is blocked or a rival takes a single pier, those families don't eat. They look to me to keep the peace, but peace in this city is bought with a currency of nerves." He finally leaned back, rubbing his face with his hands. The gauze was gone from his knuckles, leaving behind thin, silver scars. He looked less like a dragon and more like a man holding up the weight of a falling sky. Melhane moved behind him, her hands hesitating before resting on his shoulders. She felt the iron-hard tension in his muscles, the physical manifestation of 1,000 secrets. "You carry all of them on your back," she whispered. "Is that why you were so serious that night at the bar? Because you were already carrying them." Jinvaar reached up, covering her hand with his own. He pulled her around until she was standing at his side. "That night, I was deciding whether to start a war. My mind was full of logistics, blood, and debt." He paused, his gaze intensifying as he looked up at her. "Then a girl with wide eyes and a reckless heart walked up and kissed me, and for 3 seconds, the weight disappeared." The confession was a revelation. To the world, he was the monster who enforced the law of the Syndicate. To his people, he was the shield that kept the chaos at bay. But to Melhane, he was a man who was desperately tired of the silence. She leaned down, her natural hair brushing against his forehead, and for the first time, it wasn't the chairman she saw. It was a man who had forgotten how to breathe without looking over his shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone tonight," she murmured. Jinvaar didn't answer with words. He simply closed his eyes, leaning his head against her as if her presence were the only sanctuary he had left in a world of wolves. But as the rain intensified, a sharp rhythmic pulsing came from the transponder on the desk. A red light began to flash, a silent alarm that signaled a breach in the outer perimeter. The moment of peace shattered. Jinvaar was on his feet in a second, the exhaustion vanishing behind the mask of the chairman. He looked at the screen, his jaw tightening into a familiar lethal line. "The peace has been broken," he said, his voice dropping to that chilling velvet rasp. "It seems Park's allies have found a way inside." The breach was not a failure of technology, but an exploitation of the past. As the red lights pulsed rhythmically against the library walls, the security monitors revealed the unthinkable. Standing at the service entrance, a door meant only for deliveries and vetted staff, were three familiar figures, their faces pale and distorted by the grain of the closed-circuit cameras. It was the Golden Trio. The co-workers who had turned Melhane's life into a nightmare were now the keys to her destruction. They weren't holding cameras this time. They were being herded forward by men in tactical gear, their eyes wide with a terror that suggested they had been plucked from their ordinary lives to serve a much darker purpose. They knew the delivery codes, Melhane whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. They overheard the manager talking about the penthouse supply lines back at the bar. Jinvaar's face was a masterpiece of cold, focused rage. He didn't waste time on shock. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a sleek, matte black handgun, checking the chamber with a metallic click that sounded final. They didn't just know the codes, Melhane. They were paid to remember them. The betrayal cut deeper than a blade. The women who had initiated the dare out of petty jealousy had become the ultimate weapon for Jinvaar's rivals. By using people from her world, the enemies had bypassed the high-level encryption of the Sang-Hee security, preying on the one vulnerability Jinvaar had never accounted for, the mundane leftovers of Melhane's old life. "Stay behind the reinforced glass in the study," Jinvaar commanded, his voice shifting into the authoritative rasp of the chairman. "Do not open it for anyone but me. If the lights go out, do not move." He turned to leave, but Melhane caught his sleeve. On the monitor, she saw the lead woman of the trio, the one who had hissed the dare into her ear, tripping over her own feet, a man behind her raising a silenced weapon to the back of her head to force her forward. They were pawns, destined to be discarded the moment the doors were breached. "Jinvaar, they're terrified," she said, her voice trembling. Jinvaar looked at the screen, then back at her, his eyes hardening into flint. "They brought wolves to my doorstep, Melhane. In my world, there is no mercy for the hand that opens the gate." He vanished into the hallway just as the power grid hummed and died, plunging the penthouse into a suffocating artificial midnight. The only light remaining was the dim, ghostly glow of the emergency transponder on the desk. Melhane huddled in the corner of the study, the silence of the room now filled with the distant, muffled sounds of struggle, the heavy thud of bodies, the hiss of suppressed gunfire, and a single, piercing scream that was cut short by a chilling silence. The past and the present had collided in a spray of violence, and as she sat in the dark, she realized that the Golden Trio had finally gotten what they wanted. They had made her the center of the story, but the ending was being written in blood. The Grand Conservatory was a cathedral of glass, lace, and lethal intent. Thousands of white orchids hung from the ceiling, their scent cloying and thick, masking the metallic tang of the weapons hidden beneath silk waistcoats. This was the Winter Gala, the annual truce between the city's most dangerous men, and Melhane stood at Jinvaar's side in a gown of midnight velvet that felt like armor. Jinvaar was the center of the room's gravity, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He spoke in the low, rhythmic tones of a diplomat, but his eyes never stopped scanning the balcony. He knew the peace was a thin veil. Melhane, however, was no longer the trembling waitress who had stumbled into his car. She had learned to read the room as he did, to look for the hand that lingered too long near a jacket, or the eyes that refused to meet the chairman's gaze. "Stay close," Jinvaar murmured, his lips brushing her temple as he greeted a rival official. "The air is changing." He was right. Near the ice sculpture at the far end of the hall, Melhane spotted a server moving with a stiff military precision that had nothing to do with hospitality. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was watching the chandelier above the center table where Jinvaar was scheduled to sit for the toast. Melhane followed the man's line of sight and saw a faint red glint nestled among the crystal prisms of the light fixture. A remote detonated charge. Before she could alert Jinvaar, the server's hand moved toward his breast pocket. In the same heartbeat, the music swelled, a crescendo of violins designed to drown out a sudden scream or the click of a trigger. Melhane didn't hesitate. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the element of surprise that only a trophy could possess. She stumbled intentionally, lurching toward the server with a sharp cry, spilling her flute of champagne across his front. The man flinched, his thumb slipping from the small black remote he had been about to press. "Oh, I am so sorry," Melhane gasped, her voice loud enough to draw the eyes of every guard in the vicinity. As the man tried to shove her aside, she grabbed his wrist with a strength born of pure, desperate survival, feeling the cold plastic of the detonator against her palm. She didn't let go. She looked up, her gaze locking onto Jinvaar's across the crowded floor. The chairman didn't need an explanation. He saw the struggle, the server's panicked expression, and the glint of the remote. He moved with a speed that blurred the edges of the room, a predator reclaiming his territory. He reached them just as the server pulled a blade, his arm swinging in a wide, lethal arc toward Melhane's throat. Jinvaar caught the man's arm mid-air, the sound of snapping bone lost in the sudden panicked silence of the guests. He didn't look at the assassin. He looked only at Melhane, his hand reaching out to steady her as his guards swarmed the perimeter. The remote fell to the floor, sliding harmlessly across the marble. The threat was neutralized, but the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion could have been. Jinvaar pulled her into the hard protective curve of his chest, his heart hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against her own. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a raw, jagged thread of disbelief. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers as the world erupted into chaos around them. And for the first time, Melhane didn't feel like a captive in a gilded cage. She felt like the queen of a crumbling empire, holding the only heart that mattered. The aftermath of the gala did not result in a retreat, but a coronation. The city's underworld had expected the chairman's weakness to be his undoing. Instead, they discovered that his union with the woman from the lounge had forged something far more resilient. The blood had been washed from the conservatory floors, but the memory of Melhane standing over a fallen assassin remained burned into the minds of every syndicate leader in the territory. A week later, the penthouse doors opened not for a delivery or a desperate plea, but for a council. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent tension of men who were used to being the most dangerous people in any room. They sat around the long obsidian table, their eyes fixed on the man at the head. But their focus was divided. Melhane stood at Jinvaar's right hand. She was no longer dressed in the simple uniform of a waitress or the vulnerable lace of a victim. She wore a suit of charcoal silk that mirrored the sharp lines of the man beside her, her natural hair styled with a regal, effortless confidence. She didn't stay in the shadows of the mezzanine anymore. She was the shadow. "The docks are still contested," one of the lieutenants stated, his voice hesitant as he looked between the chairman and the woman at his side. "Park's remaining loyalists are refusing the new terms. They say the Sang-Hee have grown soft." Jinvaar didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, his fingers tracing the edge of a gold-embossed card on the table, but his gaze drifted toward Melhane. It was a silent consultation, a public acknowledgement of a power dynamic that had shifted the very foundations of the syndicate. Melhane leaned forward, her hands resting flat on the mahogany surface. "Softness is an illusion created by those who don't understand the difference between a riot and a revolution," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "The terms are not a request. They are the price of continued existence. If they refuse, they aren't just fighting the chairman. They are fighting the future." A profound silence settled over the room. The lieutenants looked at one another, seeing the unwavering support in Jinvaar's eyes. He wasn't just humoring her, he was listening. In the brutal patriarchal world of the Korean Mafia, a woman's voice was usually a whisper at best. But Melhane had earned her seat through blood and lace, and Jinvaar had made it clear that her word carried the weight of his own iron will. "You heard her," Jinvaar said, his voice dropping to that familiar lethal rasp. "The terms stand. Dismissed." As the men filed out of the room, their heads bowed in a new kind of respect, the heavy doors clicked shut, leaving the two of them in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Jinvaar stood and turned to her, his controlled mask finally softening into something approaching peace. He reached out, his thumb catching the line of her jaw with a tenderness that no longer felt like a threat. "They fear you now," he murmured, a faint, dark smile touching his lips. Melhane looked up at him, her unguarded heart finally finding its rhythm within the storm. "Let them. Fear is a reliable language." She was no longer the girl who wanted to be invisible. She was the heartbeat of the Sang-Hee Syndicate, the only person capable of calming the monster and the only one he truly served. As they stood together against the backdrop of the sprawling city, Melhane realized that the dare was finally over, and the rain had just begun.